Welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is centered around enforcing your cybersecurity policy. This topic is ideal for chief technology officers, chief compliance officers, and CIOs of financial services firms. We're going to specifically look into the needs and recommendations of the SEC and FINRA when it comes to cybersecurity. A little background on myself. I'm currently CEO and co-founder of Entrada, which is a developer of cybersecurity software and infrastructure technology for financial services firms and other regulated industries. I have over 15 years of experience in the area of software and hardware technology, spanning cybersecurity, enterprise cloud, and vertical software applications, particularly in the areas of financial services. A project that I worked on very recently was that for the NSA to accelerate Suite B cryptographic algorithms. Suite B is a new form of cryptography designed and approved for protecting national security systems. My academic background spans 4 years at Berkeley, working towards a degree in electrical engineering and computer science, and then we worked on some foundational internet and open source protocols that are widely used to connect servers on the web as well as deliver email securely from point A to point B. Today's topic is centered around these core items. First and foremost, we're going to look at the recent SEC cybersecurity case, and we're going to try to glean some lessons learned from that particular case. We're also going to look at SEC's field alert and recommendations when it comes to cybersecurity. I've also got a cybersecurity policy that we'll kind of look through to look at different elements that make up a good cybersecurity policy. We'll also talk about some systems that you could use to automate cybersecurity policy enforcement. And specifically, we'll look at reports that you could generate to elevate your cybersecurity posture, but also meet SEC and FINRA guidelines. Now, to set some background, cybercrime is the number 2 most common crime perpetrated against financial services firms, and in particular, financial advisory firms. This, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers's report that came out in 2014. Yet another interesting statistic is the fact that the number of attacks against financial services firms has grown to as much as 300% in the last year. So these numbers are staggering. It's no surprise that SEC recently put out a press release where they talk about how they fined a St. Louis-based investment management firm a sum of $75,000, specifically for failing to implement a firewall or encrypting any sort of client data. But more importantly than that, this firm also did not establish any procedures for responding to a cybersecurity incident, which was a clear violation of the safeguards rule that was adopted in 2000 under the Securities Act of 1933. So to sort of dig into the details of what actually happened here, the name of the firm is RT Jones, and RT Jones handles approximately 8,000 client accounts, and they've got about $500 million in assets under management. Artesis was a tool that RT Jones used to basically do 2 things. One, allow their clients to enter personally identifiable information into their website. And 2, to be able to match that information against a portfolio of products that some of their retirement plan sponsors had basically uploaded to this program. And the whole idea was to be able to match clients with the appropriate retirement plan. The catch, however, was a lot of this information was in a third-party web server, and that third-party web server was not adequately protected. In fact, that third-party web server had access to about 100,000 clients worth of information. And between 2009 and 2013, when the system was hacked, the service was used over a 4-year period, and not enough documentation was in place to be able to prove if they actually had any sort of protection around that web server. Interesting case, kind of puts the whole topic in perspective. So what are some of the lessons learned from this particular case? Well, first and foremost, documenting a set of policies and procedures governing cybersecurity and incident response is probably the most important thing that you can take away. Number two is automating an enforcement system to make sure that the cybersecurity policy that you do have in place is in fact what has been implemented in practice. So being able to reconcile those two things is a very critical aspect of putting together a good procedure around cybersecurity. Third is educating employees and contractors about your firm's cybersecurity policies. And last but not the least is having the ability to do an independent third-party study on the vulnerabilities that might exist when it comes to your cybersecurity protocols. And more importantly than that is looking at ways where you could do penetration testing. It's also commonly called black box testing, where you could take your environment and try to break it from the outside by using the help of third-party firms or ethical hacking firms that can actually design a penetration test, especially for your environment. So let's talk about some ways in which we could do some of the things that we talk about here. But before we do that, it's no surprise that the SEC put out their original guidance back in April of 2014, and they talk about specific things that they would like to see financial services firms implement in their cybersecurity procedures and policies. Here's a snippet from their document. In fact, they have an entire appendix to their field alert that they put out, which covers many areas that they recommend financial services firms implement in their respective practices. Some of the things they talk about are pretty onerous. Things like having an active inventory of all physical devices and systems that the firm is using, and doing this on a periodic basis. Taking a look at all software, platforms, and applications that the firm is utilizing to conduct their daily workflow. Looking at a map of network resources or connections and data flows between servers, client machines, and maybe some cloud apps if you're using cloud apps to be able to map out the flow of information in either direction. Looking at connections into a firm's network, both from inside of their network as well as from the outside. Logging all of the various system alerts and warnings that every system that's actually employed in practice, and keeping an active log of that. So these are just sub-bullets of point number one of some of the things that they talk about in their cybersecurity governance protocol. And there's at least 30 or 40 such items. So let's first talk about an information security policy. Well, first off, an information security policy is also called a cybersecurity policy. And the best way to get one is to actually work with your compliance firm or your compliance attorney and be able to draft one. Now, more importantly than that is to make sure that that cybersecurity policy accurately captures your current workflow in your practice. So I have an example of a cybersecurity policy that I've used extensively as we work with a number of different financial services firms. And obviously this document is customized to the needs of an individual firm. So first and foremost, you'll see in the cybersecurity policy that there is an approval chain and there's an effective date. The inside joke always with any good cybersecurity policy is that policy is out of date the day it's published. Now, as part of the policy, it's extremely important to identify exactly what that policy governs. So does that include computer hardware? Does it include your software? Does it include applications? And a good cybersecurity policy will be pretty broad in terms of the areas, but also very specific in terms of what it's doing and what policies and procedures it lays out as groundwork or a framework for employees and folks to follow. An equally important part of a good cybersecurity policy is classification of their systems. One way of classifying systems is in the way we describe here, which is 4 levels of security: red, green, white, and black. You could obviously choose to classify systems in 3 levels, but the point here is that it's important to classify the most critical information, the not so critical yet important, and the not critical information at all. So it's important to at least capture these three topics. And you should be doing this for systems, networks, data, and anything that's used to conduct your daily practice. Another equally important topic in any good cybersecurity policy is to have an acceptable use policy, which talks about specifically the area of what happens when somebody brings their own devices and uses personal devices for corporate purposes. What are the policies that employee should follow on those devices? And so it's extremely important. Do they have access to guest Wi-Fi networks? Do they have access to private networks? If they have access to the private network, how often is the private network authentication key changed? Things of that nature. User classification is extremely important, and this is a real case where we worked with a firm that had over 35 employees, and at least 5 of their employees or greater actually had access to had super administrative privileges, and when when 1 or 2 of these employees actually left, those administrative privileges were not turned off, and nobody had actually done an audit of seeing who actually had those admin privileges, and if so, what systems did they have access to. So that was a vulnerability that was discovered as part of their vulnerability assessment plan on an annual basis. So extremely important to classify users by privilege and to specifically document what privileges each user has access to. Another area is monitoring. Monitoring is an extremely important enforcement function, and therefore all financial services firms should employ good monitoring tools to be able to monitor if their employees are actually following the policy or following the protocol. And we'll talk about things a little later in this webinar to talk about how a financial services firm might actually do monitoring on systems, and if so, which areas to focus in on. Connecting to third-party networks. Now, this is a specific area of interest for the SEC. The SEC most recently talked about making sure that all vendors that a given financial services firm works with be assessed at some level. At the simplest level, every financial services firm should get the privacy policy of every vendor that they work with, and make sure they understand how the vendor protects their cybersecurity or their client data, and have evidence to show that they are in fact following that policy. And so that kind of a disclosure needs to be done at least on an annual basis. Another equally important topic is unauthorized remote access. How does a firm handle remote access into its networks, or remote access into basically corporate IT? And so it's important to basically be able to log all remote access sessions for a variety of reasons. Number one, it's called for in your cybersecurity policy. But number two, in case there's any sort of cybersecurity event, you can quickly go back and say, when that event occurred, this was the profile of the network. These were the number of users that connected in from within the network. These were the number of users that connected from outside the network. So it's an extremely important policy to follow because unauthorized remote access is probably one of the most common ways in which a hacker gains access to your infrastructure in general. Now, security, section number 9, which is probably one of the most important sections, particularly related to the SEC fine that was imposed on RT Jones, was security incident handling. How is security incidents managed in your practice? What happens when your firm experiences a breach of some sort? Who do you call? Who are the first responders? What's the protocol in terms of informing employees and informing clients? How do you actually go about auditing and trying to figure out and assess what the damage is? So there's a set of protocols that every firm should have, and so it's an important aspect to capture in any good cybersecurity policy. So this brings me to the next part of the webinar, which is what kinds of enforcement methods can a firm follow on a periodic basis? to basically elevate their cybersecurity posture. Well, here are 4 things that you can do in line with the SEC FINRA guidelines to kind of elevate your cybersecurity posture. Number 1, on a weekly basis, inventory all software that's installed on all devices. And this includes devices that all of your staff, all of your employees, and yourself use to go about your daily business. Number 2, check password policies. Make sure you understand what the password policies are. Have a written log, maybe an Excel spreadsheet if that's the simplest way in which this can be done, is essentially have a log that captures when the passwords were changed on every device that you might be using in your practice. Keep a track of the complexity. Keep a track of the expiration time. You don't obviously want to know what the passwords are, but you want to make sure that everybody is, in fact, following a password policy and an expiration time and following a minimum set of complexity guidelines as stated in your password policy in your cybersecurity document. If this becomes too cumbersome for the senior management to handle, which I can completely understand, designate one individual in the firm that can actually take responsibility for these tasks. Number 3, practice common IT hygiene. If you've got laptops, make sure all laptops have disk encryption on them. Make sure all of them have antivirus, all of them have anti-malware. And try to standardize on a common set of software tools so that it makes the job of doing number 1 a lot easier, where you can actually inventory all applications that are being used consistently across all of your systems. Number 4, make sure all communications, both in and out of your office, as well as in and out from any external site into your office or any of your cloud infrastructure, be done in a safe and secure manner. Always use technologies like VPNs to basically secure the communication or encrypt the communication traffic between point A and point B. A good rule of thumb here is make sure you have encryption for data at rest and you have encryption for data in motion. By just following these 4 simple policies and actually having active record of these policies on a weekly basis, you can do 2 things. 1, establish audit trail that you are in fact enforcing your policies on a weekly basis. And 2, just by doing this activity, the awareness amongst your staff will grow, which will reduce the likelihood that you might be hacked into from any of these systems. If you have additional Q&A, feel free to send me an email or just log on to our website, www.entrada.com, for a lot more information on cybersecurity and tips. Now, one last thing before we sign off, I wanted to show you some reports that we like to put together for firms to kind of help them with their cybersecurity policies. Here's a report that we worked on with one particular financial services firm. And in this report, all we did was we looked at all of the devices that this firm had that they were using to basically go about their daily business. And we had a list of about 8 to 9 different questions. And we would check these off on a weekly basis. And things like making sure every laptop is encrypted, making sure you have strong passwords, making sure that passwords are set to expire every 90 days, making sure every computer is protected with a firewall, things of that nature. Here's yet another example of a report that we generated for yet another firm. Just kind of keeps track of the different systems that this firm had. Number 1, a list of all devices mapped to device owners that were identified, that were visible in their office network. Looking at, a list of all devices and classifying them by operating system. Looking at the last Wi-Fi networks, last 10 Wi-Fi networks every device had connected to. And then looking at their application inventory, looking at all the applications that are actually installed on a machine, and being able to observe changes in what applications were installed from week to week. This allows us to do many different things. Number 1, be able to detect abnormal behavior. Number 2, figure out a golden pattern and be able to see if there's any irregularities relative to that golden pattern. The same thing could be done on processes, and processes are a lot more intricate, which are any applications or any services that are running in real time on a machine, being able to be proactive about taking inventory of all processes that are currently running, and this will detect any malicious processes that might be running that you may not have known about. So these are examples of some IT reports that you could actually generate for your practice to try to get into the rhythm of enforcing your cybersecurity policy on a regular basis. So once again, I thank you for joining us today in this webinar. Hopefully this webinar was informational and you were able to glean some ideas of how you could elevate your cybersecurity posture in your firm, as well as get caught up with all of the latest and greatest regulatory policies around cybersecurity. Once again, if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to me at sid@entrada.com or send me an email or drop us a line. Check out our website as well, www.entrada.com. So I've got time for a few questions that I will take at this time. Okay, great. So I've got a few questions here. Question number one, will the SEC actually ask a firm to produce evidence that they are in fact enforcing their cybersecurity policy? Excellent question. So it clearly states in the SEC guidance that came out both in April of 2014 as well as the one that came out just recently in September of 2015, they make specific recommendations as far as having a cybersecurity policy in every firm. And within the recommendations, they also talk about capturing and being proactive about reconciling implementations relative to a cybersecurity policy that you have in place. And so we've personally been involved in about 300 or 400 different audits. And almost in every audit, 3 questions get asked. Number 1, do you have a written cybersecurity policy? Number 2, can you show me evidence that the policy is in fact being enforced? And 3, they'll pick a time period and they'll say, okay, back on so-and-so date, November of last year, can you prove to me that this particular employee was in fact following policy A, policy B, policy C? So when you look at those 3 questions, it's obvious that you're going to have a written policy. That's obvious. Number 2, you're going to have some evidence to show that you enforce the policy either via periodic meetings with the staff where everybody was reporting what they were doing and they had some sort of a checklist of items that they signed off on, or the firm had implemented some sort of sophisticated monitoring system that was actually monitoring all of the different systems of their employees. And number 3, you had all of those monitoring logs time-stamped, so you could go back and say, back on this date, you in fact had followed these following policies, or this person was out of compliance, and here's what was done to remediate that particular individual. So an extremely important 3 questions to answer. Another excellent question. So question number 2, are there easier ways in which you could essentially implement the enforcement function of cybersecurity? The answer is absolutely. There's a number of tools on the market that you could use. The biggest challenge with many of the tools that are out there in the marketplace today is that you would have to combine 3 or 4 different packages to kind of get to really 3 things. One is a pretty comprehensive set of monitoring guidelines or monitoring scripts, I should say, on all your systems to be able to gather the information you need. 2 is being able to do remediation on the things that you gather. And 3rd is being able to report on everything that you monitored and you remediated and being able to get time-stamped reports. So these 3 things is what you're looking for in any solution that you're going to be evaluating to sort of automate this process. feel free to reach out to me at sid@intrader.com if you want to learn more about kinds of tools you might be able to use to do this specific activity. All right, that's all we have time for today. I wanted to thank all of you for joining this webinar. Once again, feel free to reach us either on our website or myself at sid@intrader.com if you have any other questions. I look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Have a good day. Thanks.